Michael, I thought you were going to begin our podcast today.
Hey, how are my Zoom is doing some weird stuff,
This is
just so
great.
you know. Yeah, so welcome back to the Regeneration Podcast, everybody. I'm Michael Martin, your co-host with my my comrade at arms, Mike Sauter. How's it going, brother?
Hot as Hades. I think it's probably worse for you.
No, actually, it was hot the last couple of days. It hit 90, I think, both days. Today it's only in low 80s right now, but it rained all day during the day, and now it's humid.
Yeah.
Okay. It's supposed to really cool off. I think Thursday the high is only supposed to make 63 or something.
Yeah. I live in a small little Cape Cod, and we're getting the weather one day later than you. So it's probably about 94 in the afternoon.
Yeah. And you're up on the second floor.
I am, yeah. And it used to be my daughter's bedroom. Yeah. And so I don't know, Pope Francis isn't too into air conditioning, but I'm really, really, really into air conditioning today. This room would be unreal. Unreal.
Yeah. Plus, I live in an old farmhouse. Upstairs is murder. Kids when we don't have the air conditioning on when it's hot. Yeah. Sorry, Frank. sorry. So today, I'm happy to say we're finally going to talk about something I know about. We talked to all these people, and we're finally going to talk to somebody who does what I do, an English professor. And we're going to talk I'm going to talk a bit about the state of the academy and the state of the humanities, but I hope to spend most of our time talking about one of my dearest and deepest loves, which is the work of William Shakespeare. And our guest today, Lee Oser, is that correct pronunciation for your last name?
Yes, sir.
It is a professor of English at the College of the Holy Cross in Boston, or thereabouts, a Jesuit school. And I know what that's like because I got my master's degree from a Jesuit school, the University of Detroit Mercy in Detroit, Michigan. So I know the Jesuit vibe well. And Lee received his doctorate and his master's degree both from Yale University in English literature. But correct me if I'm wrong, but your doctorate was in modernism, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Who'd you focus on?
I wrote the first Yale dissertation on T.S. Eliot in a generation. It was not a particularly good career move, so I was banished to the sticks for a couple of years, and then I got
back then.
Published. Well, Christopher Ricks saved me because he endorsed the book, so that saved my reputation.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay, let's start ripping on her right now. No, okay. So look, here's my question. Now, Lee has written quite a few books, including works of fiction and poetry. And got your CV right here. So recently, I think is your most recent book. Now I have an older CV from you. Is your most recent book of fiction, is that Oregon Confetti from Wise?
No, the Oregon Confetti came out, I think it was in 2017.
That's what it says here.
Here's the latest book is called Old Enemies, a satire, and that came out last year.
Was that also from Wise Blood?
No, Senex Press published that. And
Lee's also written scholarly monographs, including on T.S. Eliot and the ethics of modernism, moral ideas in Yeats, Eliot, Joyce, Woolf, and Beckett. That sounds like a good. And and then the return of Christian humanism, Chesterton, Eliot, Tolkien, and the romance of history. So it's high time we had you on the Regeneration.
And the Shakespeare one, Humanism.
Wait,
Shakespeare.
Guys, wait! I'm here with my props. This is the Shakespeare book.
That's the one.
All right. Now, when did that come out?
That came out last year too.
Okay,
I had two books last year: a novel and this
monograph.
Scholarly.
Who put that out? Who put that out?
That's Catholic University of America Press.
Okay.
I just listened to your podcast with First Things, and I'm just not lying. It's a book that I already know I'm ordering. And I was just listening to the end of the podcast about 20 minutes ago. But my favorite chapter in all of nonfiction is John Kelper Powys' chapter called The Religion of Rabelais. And you're mining some of the same territory, and we'll get into it, but I don't think there's any more important subject than extracting the stuff from Cervantes, Rabelais, Shakespeare, and then somehow, I always call it a hieros gamos between what currently constitutes Catholic theology and this other tradition, which is tied to the earth and so forth, earthborn.
You might include
And hearing you talk about it wasn't just the title. Hearing you talk about it, Dr. Oser, it's wild.
You might include Chaucer
Absolutely.
in that constellation.
Yeah. Well, Whitman, I would put in there too.
Whitman.
All right, so let's start off. So now one of the things I have been interested. In fact, I'm teaching Shakespeare right now, but I have taught an online course for grown-ups on Shakespeare, magic, and religion, because it's impossible to read Shakespeare without being aware of those realities in his world. And Lee is interested, as well as I am, in this idea of religion and Shakespeare. So I wonder if you could just jump right in and talk about the Shakespeare and Catholicism.
Okay, happy to go there. So there was what's called the religious turn in Shakespeare studies.
Yep.
Many people date it to around 1990 or the 90s. It's a little hard to date. There are some precursor books that are significant, particularly the late Jesuit Peter Millward had a book called Shakespeare's Religious Background, which got some things wrong, but nonetheless opened up the field in an important way. In the 90s and the 20th century, people who were not at all inclined to Catholicism nonetheless got into this conversation, including Stephen Greenblatt of Harvard, who is in many ways a magnificent scholar. And when he wants to write a very good readable book, he certainly can. I've always been I've always been at odds with his Foucauldian approach. I've always been at odds with his death of the author, new historicism that reduces Shakespeare to an author function. I think that's quite wrong and quite depressing for the humanities, and I think it's had a terrible effect in the long run.
Yeah, and these are the people, rightly, who look around the English department and say, why don't we have any majors anymore?
Right.
Yeah.
And yet Greenblatt's a brilliant guy, and his book Hamlet in Purgatory is eminently readable, and I warmly recommend it to anyone who's interested in the subject. Anyway, so what you go back to the turn in religion, and you get a number of scholars who start to make a case for a distinctly Catholic Shakespeare or a distinctly Protestant Shakespeare. And let me see if I can just summon a few names. There's a very a good man, a learned man, but quite a Catholic apologist named Joseph Pearce, who wrote a book that got panned a bit unfairly in First Things.
I was really going to be curious about your opinion, because he writes so many books. I've read him on Belloc and I've read him on Chesterton, and both those are fine. But to go into Shakespeare studies, he had to get beaten up because he didn't have the time to spend there.
Yeah, well, I just want to say that I have a great deal of respect for Joseph Pearce. On the other hand, he writes as a Catholic apologist, and he wanted a Catholic Shakespeare, and so what you're left with is a kind of he has a fine prose style. He has a logical command of the facts that are at his disposal. But if you know the field, you're going to be kind of unhappy with the case that he makes. It comes across, whether he's writing about Macbeth or Hamlet, as a bit too partisan. Yet he scatters jewels along the way, and I'm the last guy to put him down. He's a tough guy. He's fair-minded. So we disagree in our take on the Bard. So then you get people who lean in the direction of a Protestant Shakespeare, and I would think particularly of a man like John D. Cox, who recently retired from Hope College in the Midwest. And I consider John to be the best scholar on Christianity and religion of his generation. I think he's absolutely the best. I think he's done the most important work. And he establishes the idea of Shakespeare's Christian skepticism. So you have to think, for a parallel, you have to go to someone like Montaigne, who was, of course, Catholic. But the idea is that these guys are not going to go all the way out on these crazy dogmatic doctrinal issues, that they're going to stick to the core of Christian teaching. And they're very fond of Montaigne's question, what do I know? Que sais-je? So a kind of skepticism at work in John Cox's Protestant reading. I admire John a great deal, and yet the case for the Catholic Shakespeare lingers. It has significant 19th century origins, and I'm not ready to dismiss it. What my own position is that we don't know, but I think it is safe to say that Shakespeare was a Christian thinker. He's completely absorbed in theology. He looks at the world through a religious lens. He's virtually obsessed with the Last Judgment. People who read Hamlet, they somehow miss the fact that it's constantly talking about the Last Judgment.
Mm-hmm.
He's very interested in the great Reformation debate over free will. You know, the Reformation really starts with this Joe Frazier versus Muhammad Ali slugfest between Erasmus and Luther on the question of free will.
And you center that on A Midsummer's Night Dream.
Yeah, well, that's the first place I go, but I pursue that arc. That's a through line for me in my book. So, and of course, the question of free will doesn't go away. Our entire legal system hinges somehow on the notion that we're endowed with free will. In other words, we're exceptional to the natural order of things. And yet our intellectual caste, C-A-S-T-E, I don't know, maybe they're just a cast of characters. They for a long time have preferred their models of determinism and materialism and meat puppetry, but now even that's coming to bite them in the rear end, because again, you've got the Foucauldians in the classroom, and then you've got people who can't believe in anything, and it turns out that William James was right. We have to believe in something just to get by. I believe I have friends. I believe people love me. I believe my life has some meaning. And if it's the Academy's job to disabuse us of those illusions, well, the Academy is just setting up a dystopian life for its charges.
Great.
Which is what it is.
Which is what it is.
Yeah, it is, really is. In the humanities, anyway. I mean, you know, when I was an English major, it was the primo major, right? It was the cream of the crop. And now, well, here's a good example where the place where I got my doctorate, they used to run in Wayne State University in Detroit. They used to run, until relatively recently, 11 or 12 sections of Shakespeare a semester. And now I know they have a hard time filling one or two.
I'm sure it's one.
And where I've been teaching, I won't name it, but I've been teaching part-time there since the place where the Catholic college where I taught closed abruptly 6 years ago. I'm the only person who teaches Shakespeare there, and I've been there for 4 years. And this semester I'm teaching for only the second time in 4 years because they couldn't get enough people to take the class. They scheduled it 2 or 3 times and had to cancel.
The thing that I think we need to be very clear about is that the humanities is in an utter state of collapse. Mm-hmm. Now, there have been many leading journals and newspapers covering these stories lately. The New Yorker had an influential piece. The New York Times just ran a piece about how Generation Z thinks college is, by and large, they think college is a waste of time and a waste of money. So what you have is a swamp. What you have is a terrible mess where the great literature is not being taught, and where what you're seeing in its place is just fashionable social justice questions that, well, make up in a terrible way, make up for the lack of serious intellectual inquiry. So you get rid of serious intellectual inquiry, rigorous thinking, You put in its place a bunch of fashionable stuff. And who really are you serving? You're not serving people who want to rise in the world, who want to work hard, who have the potential to realize their talents, their real talents, they're smart. They're not super wealthy, but this is traditionally what colleges were for in this country. This is why we started the City University and the State University in New York. My mother taught at Queens College. It was the Harvard of the City University. These smart kids, immigrant kids would come in. They didn't have a lot of dough, but it became the key to social mobility. Well, as the New York Times piece that ran just this week points out, we've lost the social mobility. So what do we have? Social justice, blah, blah. But it's just really a way of initiating the well-to-do in their particular world of contacts. So we're complacent with it. We have an administrative regime that is bloated as a sack of parasites, raking in all this dough, sucking in all this dough, and in effect blocking the old meritocratic arrangements, the old arrangements of meritocracy. Now, lads, if I may, I want to read a paragraph. This is the last of my prepared items. Okay, so after that, I'm winging it.
Okay.
This is from.
I'm liking what you're saying.
This is from my old prof at Reed College. Now, I will not name him, but he was a huge influence on my life. And he's a guy, he's retired now. He's what I would call an old school liberal. And he's one of those guys, and they're around, and women too, of course, who are just wondering what the hell happened. And how did it happen so fast? And it's really happened fast. So here's his comment on Reed College, my alma mater, 1988. They educated me. I was the year before I went to Reed College, I was the equivalent of a taxi driver. I was doing a delivery service. The first time I went to Reed College, I was so impressed by the state of the restrooms. I thought, oh my gosh, these are gorgeous restrooms. That's my first memory of Reed. There was a black guy named Ray Warren who gave me a chance. He was their chief admissions officer. He sat me in his office for hours. We talked about Dostoevsky. We talked about Ezra Pound. These were things I was reading. I was clearly engaged intellectually. So he said, okay, we're going to take a chance. We're going to take a chance on you. And that turned my life around. It gave me a chance to escape being really broke. I mentioned my mother taught at Queens. Let me be clear. I was raised by a single working mom who started off as a high school substitute teacher and made her way to the special education program at Queens College, which was a special education program for Black students who were underprivileged, but they then decided they didn't want to have any white faculty around. So my mother and her generation, she was rescued by the Queens College English department. But nonetheless, we were raised lower middle class. We didn't have a lot. I was scared of poverty. I was afraid of it. And Reed College saved me. Reed, this is my former prof, great man, fine scholar, writing, you didn't ask, but I can quote a former high-level administrator who must remain anonymous. Quote, old Reed is dead. New Reed isn't worth saving, end quote. The mission seems these days to have everything to do with social justice fashion and nothing to do with rigorous intellectual inquiry. A recent grad thesis student of mine from 2016 stopped by for tea. She is attending law school at Lewis and Clark, hardly the best career move these days, but better than tending bar. She says that in her interactions with current Reed students, she finds that she has nothing at all in common. He ends by saying liquid modernity seems to be sweeping the tables. I take that liquid modernity to be a reference to liquidity. And is it? Yeah.
I think it's a Charles Taylorism.
Is it a Charles Taylor line? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, thank you. So there you have it, and it's happened fast, and we have got to figure out what to do, and we've got to try to correct the situation, and we have to be very serious about it.
Yeah, I mean, those social justice props, they came in and destroyed the joint, right? And I saw this 20 years ago. I was teaching, and I was always kind of the outlier in our English department, where I was the person who really loved literature and wanted to help students find the way in, right? Because you saw those kids, right? They would come in and they just loved books when they were in high school, and they wanted to really find out more about this discipline of English literature. And most professors at that time, and I think most places you go, their underlying message was that it's all a ripoff. It's all about privilege, and it's all about oppression. And then the kids started to drop off one by one, where when I started at Marygrove, which is a small liberal arts college, we probably had 2000 or so, I bet we had 45 or 50 English majors in a school that was not all that big, maybe 60. I think the place I'm teaching now, which is even bigger than Marygrove, they'd be lucky to have 30. So
I think, yeah,
and I don't know what happened.
So a number of things happen, and again, I don't want my position to be confused with some kind of cheap resentment, that I'm an angry white man, blah, blah, blah. Now, I've raised my children. I've had a successful life. I've written my books. I'm a good scholar. I'm not just frothing at the mouth and steaming out the ears. It's not what's going on here. But we're trying to reconstruct what happened. And we can't necessarily, draw specific effects from specific causes. It can get to be a logical fallacy. But having worked in the field for decades, I have some sense of what happened. And so I think that the radical feminists were too demanding. It's funny because there's a story by Virginia Woolf that she tells. It's an old English folktale. It's probably global, called The Fisherman and His Wife.
Yep.
And I think she tells it in Into the Lighthouse, one of her great novels. And it's a very interesting counterpoint to her own feminist sort of preferences, her own feminist biases. But it's like Woolf the artist to do that, to balance things out. She's, well, we're going to balance this out now and tell the story of the fisherman and his wife. And the wife is just too demanding. And the feminists were they had to have it all. I think back to Dorothy Day's suspicion about these folks, that they were, kind of spoiled. They were well-to-do. They were really not the people that needed this kind of political support. And that in the end, their militancy was not going to help the poor. And it didn't help the poor. As we've watched what's happened to social mobility, colleges are no longer helping social mobility. Now, this is a complicated thing. Gender issues are always tricky. One of the things that I've discovered in my work on particularly on Shakespeare, but also in earlier scholarship, is there were superb and leading women scholars in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and I cite a lot of them in my Shakespeare book. Some of them just did wonderful, lasting work. But they weren't writing as feminists. They were just writing as scholars and as important scholars. I mean, once things started to change, I think Oxford actually changed before Cambridge, admitting women into the doctoral programs. Once it started to change, it changed at a pretty reasonably good clip. I remember sitting with my, if I may say without any affectation, my Yale mentor, who's passed on a few years ago.
Who was your mentor?
It was Marie Boroff.
Okay.
Marie Boroff, and she was the translator of the Gawain poet. So Sir Gawain in the Green Knight has seen a lot of service, and also a good poet in her own right and a great teacher. And I remember we were at an event a number of years ago for a very important organization that I want to tout for a moment the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers. The Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers, that's the ALSCW. And I was president of that association for a couple of years. We've worked to try to keep a foothold in English departments and comp lit departments.
When were you founded?
We were founded about 25 years ago. People like John Hollander, Rosanna Warren were important for the founding. Dennis Donahue was another one. So we had a number of good people who came together. Mostly they were reacting against theory at the time. They felt that theory was, and by the way, that theory was basically driven by white men. So let's be fair to what's going on here. Although, certainly there were feminist players in the world of theory. There's no doubt about that. So it's not just the feminists there. And really, I don't mind the feminists at all. It's the radical feminists. It's the people for whom literature is a mode of false consciousness. That is what I don't subscribe to. And so I was at a conference in Illinois and with Marie, and we were sitting around a table. And this was at Champaign-Urbana, which is the flagship of the Illinois University. So it's a very fine university. They produced a lot of great people, had storied faculty over the decades. And the medievalist was a woman who was in her 50s or 60s. I was younger at the time. And she was sitting with me and Marie, and she started to complain about, just the obstacles that she'd had to overcome as a woman scholar. And Marie, who's super accomplished, who was, I think, the first woman in the graduate program, or maybe even the English department at Yale. There's a picture of her from the late 50s, early 60s, probably early 60s, with all of those eminences. There's Warren and Brooks and the whole crowd. They're there, and she's there front and center, wearing a skirt with her knees tightly together, and boy, could she handle them. She could handle them. So she turned around to her colleague from Illinois, who was sort of being presumptuous, complaining in front of me, and I was going to have a hard time. At that time, I was on the job market. I was not the preferred gender at that point. And Marie just turned around to her interlocutor point blank and said, no, they recognized me at every turn. They never rejected me. It was always fine. Well, that's a heroic story.
That's heroic, yeah.
Yeah, that's a story that works. And that way you don't lower the expectations. You don't create a culture of aggrievement. And of course, there were women who were powerhouses at a time when other women were respected for staying home and raising their children. We didn't have these cultural wars in that respect. So, but I think that the radical feminists, speaking very specifically of the radicals who found literature to be a realm of false consciousness, they paved the way for the demoralizing of the male scholar. We've kind of left the field. The field has been ceded to women more and more, and then also to the ressentiment of the identity politics, where people come in and say, oh, well, it's this white canon is just, all false consciousness for me. But again, the subtle historical realities have no place in this conversation. What's the use of saying the great masters of the Harlem Renaissance knew Shakespeare up and down? Of course they did. And once they absorbed Shakespeare, they were off on their own. They could do what they needed to do.
Right.
Yeah. So, and there's no color divide for Shakespeare. The boys admired Shakespeare to no end. Cullen was deeply in debt to, in a friendly, gracious debt to Keats, of course. So, and then you read Toni Morrison, you realize this is later, of course, but she's in constant dialogue with Faulkner. So the arts are, they're promiscuous. Do you know what I mean? The arts are promiscuous. They want to cross boundaries. They're Miles Davis was interested in Ravel, and he hooked up with his friend Bill Evans, and you've got the greatest jazz album of all time, Kind of Blue. The arts are promiscuous, and it's because they hold to the real standards. They're about people who express themselves that way. That's how they speak. They do art. It's not because they want to be artists. They do it because they have to do it, and they need to learn from people who do it well. So I don't know what to say for the humanities. It seems to have, these people seem to be kind of fake people with their own little bourgeois agenda. And it's very sick that it's been supported by a kind of political regime. I'm very sorry for that, but
I will make a plug. A guest we had on last week, who taught at the Gregorian Social Sciences, because I've read a lot into this field, but it's our friend Guido Preparata. His book, it's Palgrave Macmillan, but it hasn't been read enough. The Ideology of Tyranny. I still think it's the best on this. We've seen Carl Truman and other people kind of go at this. I think Preparata's book far and away is the best, because it captures that political part and puts it in the right perspective right away, and shows the genealogy, the etiology from Bataille through in a completely different way than most people tell the story, but shows that Leo Strauss and Michel Foucault they're working from the same blueprint, folks. But all of this is that political game that takes away universities, their ability to support people who think.
Yeah. Well, this is a big question now. I'm of two minds about it with respect to my friend Mark Bauerlein and his friend Rufo. Is it Chris Rufo?
Chris Russo,
They had letters in the Wall Street Journal responding to one of the journal's columnists, who was coming from a kind of old school left, arguing that the liberal arts are not about politics. And it's been Rufo's contention that the liberal arts are about politics. And he quotes Aristotle in the Politics. And Rufo's, of course, a smart guy. Now, where we might be coming from on this would be something like Newman's ideal and the idea of a university, that you've really got to nurture a kind of intellectual health for its own sake, that learning is good for its own sake. He uses that phrase a lot. From there, you get Arnoldian disinterestedness. So, I mean, I see what Rufo's saying, and I admire Mark's work a lot. And I do think the people need to pay much closer attention to what's going down there at that new college in Florida, because it's another place that stinks. It's another place where they've let the curriculum go to hell, where they're not doing serious work, where they're
what place in Florida?
I think it's their honors college, and I think it's called New College. If I'm
okay,
I could be wrong about that, but
this is Steven Pinker's at this place, right? This is the place.
Oh wow, okay.
DeSantis fired the board of trustees, and then Rufo came in with Mark, and I have correspondence with Mark, and I know Mark's kind of an old school liberal himself. He's very invested in real education, and he's trying to save these kids from being defrauded. And of course, you hear from the very loud ones, and then the press disgraces itself with its handling of these issues, which really need careful discussion.
I just read that Pat Sajak is the chair of the board of Hillsdale College. Did you know that, Michael?
No, I
know that.
Is he a game show host or something?
Yeah, he is. Yeah.
Which is 40 miles away from where I live.
Yeah, right. You spoke there, Michael.
I did speak there. And now, actually, Lee, you reminded me of Stanley Fish's book, Save the World on Your Own Time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I'm thinking of, at the same time you said this literary professional association was formed, and I forget which one. It might have been the Organization of American Historians, but people like Eugene Genovese, we're talking 25 years ago or so, they had to come up with their own journals. Christopher Lash's daughter, Elizabeth Lash Quinn, was involved. But so
those are good people. Those are great people.
The people who are pushing back.
Yeah.
It's been 25 years, but we keep on losing. The early people who were fighting this in the history departments, I was so proud of them, founding their own journal. They were always the brightest people in the room. But from what I understand in the last 25 years, it's just gotten bleaker and bleaker.
Okay, so we talked about the whole theory rah-rah of the 90s. We remember that was largely white guys acting badly. Then we talked about radical feminism, how with their charges of false consciousness. See, the white thing that come back to the deconstruction is that you can't say anything meaningful. Okay,
Right.
language doesn't mean anything. Well, that's not healthy. Then literature is false consciousness, radical feminist version, then followed by the identity politics version. So just to finish this sequence of sorrow and catastrophe, let's also bear in mind that the most craven tribe that has ever existed are the administrators of these American colleges. These people are so responsible for disaster after disaster after disaster, going back to, and I'm sorry to say this because I hear he's a good guy. Dick Broadhead's handling of the lacrosse fiasco down at Duke. He was completely wrong. He just enabled that situation to run amok. There were no grown-ups. I think the leadership at Yale, this guy's just stepping down. He was horrible. They've had terrible crap at identity politics crap at Yale. That Drew Gilpin Faust, what W.C. Field says, I could carve a better man out of a banana. And on it goes. The leadership, they don't stand for anything. They get these bloated salaries. They succumb to the stupid political winds. But of course, if you're going to make noise, political noise on the campus, you're going to have the sympathy of the Washington Post and the New York Times and Kamala Harris and the usual cast of goofballs. And now I do think, now on the brighter side, I see that some of the younger writers at the Times are savvier and seem to give a damn, and they're responsible to the reality. So I think I'm seeing a shift there. I get the Times, and some of the reporting has really impressed me and given me hope. So maybe just for the sake of its own survival, the younger generation or the younger generations, I'm an old guy, 65, they will start to talk turkey and get it right and realize, well, do we want Shakespeare? Do we want literature? How do we want to educate the young? Why are they so unhappy? Hello, hello, knock, knock, knock.
Yeah. Well, I think another thing, I mean, not just the administrators, but maybe the invisible presence is probably the most, besides administrators who are midwits, but it's really the accreditation agencies, right? Who force this crap onto colleges and students, and the administrators never have guts to say no, right? They never push back.
Is there federal funding? What is the relationship between these accreditation agencies and the federal government? Is there support?
There's a great thing you're doing that's emblematic. So I don't know the answer. Maybe Michael does, but like I'm looking at students today, and they're never questioning the nexus of their colleges and federal government like they did in the 60s, right? I've been a campus minister, and I've adjuncted at SUNY Geneseo over the course of a number of years. And it's a very liberal college, but I said, like, the most important questions you're not asking, like the revolving door between.
They don't.
Yeah, this never occurs. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I was glad that, like, we want to teach people who would even know to ask such questions.
Well, to go back to what you were saying, there was a place I know nearby. I was looking at their humanities, like an intro to humanities course, and they had all this DEI crap shoved in there. And it wasn't just a little bit. It was, hours of homework a week on DEI junk. And I said to the chair of that department, I said, what are you doing that for? I mean, whose idea was this? I said, well, we have to do that because the accreditation agency is making us do it. And the relationship there is the accreditation agencies are like, they're the muscle from the government, right? They're the World Economic Forum for the higher education, because they're like the go-between, and I'm sure they're getting pressure from Washington to make sure those policies get inserted someplace and ad nauseum. And of course, so many of the faculty have been I would brainwash might not be the right word, but trained in that's what they think is learning, that they go along with it. And faculty in general don't push back about anything.
Now, let me give a couple just brief stories, a couple anecdotes about that. Uh, take something like the Kavanaugh hearings. I think that with distance, we're recognizing that that was a very bad moment for the nation. When I talk to friends about it, even people who hate Kavanaugh, I say one word to them. It's very effective. Avenatti. Remember Michael Avenatti?
Right.
Michael Avenatti was all over the front page of the New York Times with his absurd allegations. Horrible defamation of character. And as far as Christine Blasey Ford goes, never a shred of evidence. Not a shred. And sue me if I'm wrong. That's the way it was. Her best friend said, I can't confirm what she's saying. There was a big nothing burger. And yet the powers of the media and the certain political folks rallied around her, made her a cause célèbre. In the academy, you could not possibly question the wisdom of Christine Blasey Ford. You could not possibly question the perfidy.
That's your main point, is that in the academy, it wasn't even possible.
Yeah, it was. So folks, you want to know the weather, that's the temperature. That's what's going on here. So let me just give another example. This will be closer to home for me as a literary scholar. So I mentioned my Yale mentor, a woman named Marie Boroff, and I'm proud to say there's now a Marie Boroff chair at Yale University. Magnificent person. I love her. I could get teary. The other person who saved my career was the English scholar Christopher Ricks. And Christopher turns 90 this month.
Wow.
He's still teaching at Boston. He's been knighted. He was knighted by the Queen. I consider Christopher to be our greatest living scholar. Now, Christopher is a man of
John Cox and Christopher Ricks. These are names I got to start reading. Okay, go ahead.
These are that's Olympian stuff.
Yeah.
Christopher published not long ago the complete poems of T.S. Eliot, and he published in two volumes, and he had a co-editor, a man named Jim McHugh. These guys did such a fantastic job. I mean, they assembled everything. They commented intelligently and pithily on every word, every line. It was a masterpiece of scholarly editing. And Ricks had considerable experience. He was also he edited the complete Tennyson. That's no small potatoes, you know. Yeah. And he also runs the Editorial Institute up at Boston University. So this is a man who's trained editors, who thinks about editing all the time. And he's a man of the left. He's extremely fair-minded. He's rigorously fair-minded. That's his deal. And he writes, he publishes this 2-volume series, magisterial, 2 volumes of the complete poems of T.S. Eliot. And he gets attacked by at the height of the Me Too movement, he gets attacked by a Villanova professor named Megan Quigley for his handling, his annotation of the bit about the chemist in The Wasteland. There's a bit of a few abortion lines in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. When Lil's husband got demobbed, I didn't mince my words. I said, why don't you get yourself a nice set of teeth? And she says, I can't help it. It's them pills I took to bring it, to pull it off. The pharmacist said it would be okay, but I never was the same after young George. So that's most of the section there, the passage. And it's a very grim, sad passage by Eliot about a sort of Schopenhauerian in its antinatalism, that the whole cycle of sexuality and birth is very punishing. And this is written in a working class milieu. Woman takes the pills to try to abort the baby. Now, by any fair judge in his or her right mind, Christopher's annotation, Rick's annotation of this was sterling. And yet, at the height of the Me Too movement, this person from Villanova, Megan Quigley, with a Yale degree,
in a Catholic university,
at a Catholic university, attacks Ricks in a journal called Modernism Modernity for his unsympathetic or stupidly male or ignorant handling of this passage. And then that wasn't enough. She took to social media with it, got on the social media bandwagon, again started drubbing Ricks. Now, Ricks is like Samuel Johnson, a dangerous man to disagree with. He's a fighter, and that's something I've learned from him. Is sometimes you do have to fight. So Ricks then, as the editor of the book review editor of the Oxford Journal Essays and Criticism, wrote a long rebuttal, painstaking. And again, to any fair-minded person, that should have been the end of the story. But no, Ricks was attacked. He was attacked by the feminists, and I would have to say the radical feminists, for not playing ball, for calling into question one of theirs. And you would never think that it's women who run this profession, that women are in power, that men are in the minority, that it took considerable courage and intellectual conviction for Ricks to reply the way that he did. So I say, from the Kavanaugh, just Orwellian nightmare situation, to Christopher Ricks' brilliant annotation of Eliot's major poetry, it's just a big temper tantrum. It's just a big show.
Yeah.
And it's hard not to despise it.
I get that. And actually, you're reminding me when I was putting together my committee for my dissertation, I asked if I could have Camila Paglia be the outside reader, and they shot me down. Should have been a gas.
Yeah, no, there's an interesting person.
Yeah,
and also a person, I think, like so many intellectuals, whose intellectual makeup comprises elements of the left and the right.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what's interesting. I and I think you see that. I mean, which has been kind of I don't know if you've noticed it too, but I have noticed over the past couple of years, I think in a way the COVID, pandemic and the responses to it brought some of the left out of the closet or out of the woodwork, who started to actually defend what used to be traditional liberalism and ideas of free speech. And you see, like Glenn Greenwald, for instance, has been pretty vocal about this, and other people as well, which has been good to see. Because I don't know about you, Lee, but I remember when my wife and I got married 31 years ago, we were suspicious of government, weren't into vaccines for our children, like the idea of eating organic food. We wanted to be organic farmers, and had home births, and people immediately assumed we were raging lefties. And now if you give that description, they think you're some kind of far right extremist, right?
Well, how dare you remember anything?
That's the truth. Absolutely the truth.
I remember being at a meeting with a member of administration at the college where I work last spring, and I was kind of sharing, not as clearly, not as nearly in depth, Dr. Oser, and just my feelings, kind of, what's been going on in the university. And then, because I've always been torn between, I mentioned the book, like Preparata, Top-Down Power, but another hero of mine, Ivan Illich, it was one insight back in the day that the Western University, which developed from monasteries, so many of them, Paris, Milan, and that those kind of broke off, it was the one institution of higher learning in the world where higher education was divorced from any type of spiritual discipline of some kind, for another ascetical self-discipline even. But all of a sudden, that kind of told a story for me for a while. Then lately, I've just come to see there's a partial truth in that. The power game explains so much more. But I was telling this one administrator that he better read church history, because I'm going back to like Ivan Illich, who predicted in the late 70s that in the not too distant future, people would be walking around the remains of universities and hospitals in North America, like we walk around the ruins of Cluny and other places, wondering how did these institutions get to be so big, right?
Well, here's the thing.
And the university doesn't, so far, it hasn't proven that it could reinvent itself like the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is going through a big death. It might die. I don't know. Yeah.
I think it's reinvented itself.
Good.
Catholic Church even better than the Catholic Church, because if you think about it, the designations assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, that's basically
a priesthood,
deacon, priest, and bishop, right? But here's
of course it is. Of course it is. Yeah.
And the academy, you know,
and the academy is so
a lot
clerical.
of people won't speak their mind until they have tenure.
Right? Well, I think also though that so what's happened? One thing about the culture, the academic culture, and this is in the wake of the politicization of the academy, which I believe goes back to the radical feminists, believe the idiotic male deconstructionists out of it. But the radical feminists, identity politics, false consciousness of high literature, well, all about power. It's all about power. They come at us with Michel Foucault. It's all about power.
Yeah.
And the younger generation that is very shrewd and canny about this, and I these horrible terms, younger generation, whatever, but young people know to use the power game. So although I was promoted to full professor fairly on in my career as an academic, I knocked out the books. Nonetheless, and this is as close as I want to come to my own experience, but I'll go there just to say this: the constant specter of the Title IX office, you see, and a lot of people, and my experience is by no way unique, but there's constant fear that so once the Title IX office became aggressive in college and university life, that really undermined the authority of the old bishops, as you would call them. You know, for my own part, I've just had to sort of find my way on my own. And I think one of the keys is I've just tried to be decent to people. You know, you put your best foot forward. I'm certainly not a saintly individual, but really, you put your best foot forward. You try to be decent with people and hope that elicits a human response.
That's a good way to go.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, but I think what happens is what's built, and it's built into the graduate school process as well, is those who go along to get along, and then people live in fear of being outed. It just
my shorthand for that is this Hungarian novelist I befriended late in life, Stephen Vizinci. He has a quote you find online. He said, it's the go along to get along thing, Michael. He said, there's no cure for stupidity, and formal education can just, it meshes it with power. I guess I'm kind of confusing the quote. There's no cure for stupidity, but a PhD has power and can be dangerous. If it is, what we know about the PhD, and I told my own 4 kids when they went to college, I tell everybody at Geneseo, you're here, I guess, in the current iteration of the university for 2 purposes. You need the piece of paper. You're spending money for it. You can probably get a good education too, but when you're in a class, realize that some of your professors are smart, some might not be at all. All we know is that they jump through the hoops, and some of them jump through the hoops with innate intelligence and hard work and came out great. But you're going to have to figure that out for yourself when you get there. But we tend to swim in this tool. Illich again saw it as schooling should be a tool. Seems like you can learn math and foreign languages pretty well by meeting in square rooms under fluorescent lights with people your own age, like every day for 45 minutes. But some of the things, the classroom model works. But, when we get distance from the tool, we can kind of see who it works for. But for young people, I'm trying to get them to get distance from the university. And I think they're doing that with meme culture. Is it going to work for me? And if I go, I can maybe take classes, I hope, from bright professors. One thing at SUNY Geneseo, if you were going to go on to med school, after you graduate, if you're taking intro to biology and you heard that one class is pretty easy and one was pretty difficult, I tell some students, I say, that's a tricky one. because you need the good grades to get into med school. You can take the easy one because they're going to reteach you biology once you get there. But I don't know if that's 100% right, but I'm always trying to work with young people to look at the university from a distance. Because remember, we enter it and we just start swimming through school. It's like this alchemical process for swimming through, and to try and get some sanity on this. I don't know what you think of that, Dr. Oser.
Well, I think we have to be careful to distinguish the case of the humanities on the one side and the sciences on the other side, science and math, the hard sciences, because I think until very recently, we could not escape the rigors of science and calculus in the classroom. We could not escape the rigors even of studying Greek and Latin.
They dropped Greek and Latin from the classics at Yale today, didn't they? Wasn't that
today? Well, I knew that Princeton was
maybe it was Princeton
in the news. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. But now there's one of the founding fathers of the ALSCW is a thinker from California, writer John Ellis.
Mhm.
And he's written very intelligently on this debacle that now increasingly we see these diversity statements have become part of teaching the hard sciences and teaching mathematics. And it gets to be a race to the bottom. And again, deal with the reality, folks. Generation Z, the New York Times tells us, thinks college is a bad idea by and large. This is what's happened. Colleges are no longer attracting the best and the brightest. If you're really smart, the last thing you want to do is become a college professor, because you'll have to mix with people who are not particularly interesting, who are, as you were suggesting, get along to get along. And that's to say they're doctrinaire. And the doctrinaire mind does not admit contradiction, and it does not admit multi-perspectivism.
Mhm. And so actually we talked, gosh, was it a little over a year ago, Mike? We talked to Professor Arthur Versluis from Michigan State. And he was also voicing some concern about the state of the academy right now. And actually we were talking at the time about, well, what comes next for the humanities? I mean, will it become like what Emerson and Thoreau did, where it kind of goes rogue and into the fields, and almost a hedge school kind of model, where
That's possible. Yeah, that's possible.
And I think so. I mean, I what I've noticed is even when I offer these occasional Shakespeare courses or other things, there are people out there who are hungry for something in the humanities, but they go into colleges, and very often it's not satisfied because of all the garbage that's shoved in there. And for instance, I recently had a student approach me who wanted to study philosophy, and she was trying to ask me what courses to take in the course catalog. And I'm looking at the courses, I said, "Oh, that looks awful. That also looks awful." Don't they teach medieval philosophy anymore? Where's classical philosophy?
AJ Ayer one.
But no, they weren't even that sophisticated. It was just dreadful. Gender and philosophy, or whatever it was. And I told her, so well, if they let me, we could do a tutorial on philosophy as a way of life, because I know that's what you're looking for, right? You're not looking to hear about philosophies. You're looking to learn how to think and to ask the life questions, as Pierre Hadot calls them, right? And I noticed that, but I don't notice it enough in colleges anymore, which is unfortunate.
I go back to my early days, and what happened was, so I didn't even attend my high school graduation. Finished about number 100 in a class of 400 at Wantagh High School by Jones Beach. I was just completely alienated from the situation.
Same here.
My brother Brian had dropped out of junior high school. And he just lived his life on the road. He became a kind of homeless guy early on. And I went to the University of Colorado for a couple of years. I was, and this is, I hope this doesn't sound the wrong way, but I was always one of those guys who could get by in a classroom without trying. I could just absorb enough. So I got out of there after 2 years. I had taken a strong interest in music, and we tried Santa Cruz with a college buddy of mine, an old high school friend. We tried Santa Cruz for a summer, ended up in the fall of '78 in Portland, Oregon. And I got to know the music scene, and I ended up playing a lot. I ended up playing a lot of music in Portland. And the thing I found was I was mixing with guys who were not necessarily college educated, who were musicians, many of them, who were smart, but we were all interested in reading. It was that time of life. So I remember my friend Evan Burton. I just saw him the other day. I was in Oregon. He married a lovely Reed College graduate, Rebecca, and saw him the other day. When we were 20, he turned me on to Ezra Pound's ABC of Reading. And you see, Pound has his great poetry, but he was also kind of a lunatic, and an anti-Semite, and I hate that. But nonetheless, if you go back to the ABC of Reading, you give a young man a book like that, it really appeals to him with its appreciation of what is lasting, what the real achievements are. What does it mean to be original? What does it mean for there to be a tradition or remain current? These are the questions that he covers in ABC of Reading, and he does it with a real kind of charm and chutzpah, and a kind of Yankee crankiness also about him, Ezra from Idaho. And then my friend Carl, who went on to become a kind of artist. He read Dostoevsky. We read Dostoevsky. We figured out who Bruegel was. Somebody had a Bruegel poster on the wall, because our minds were hungry. And it was that environment that got me to apply to Reed College and just talk about the books I'd read. So there's a natural hunger among the young. And it's so terrible that these people are being defrauded of that opportunity because of this politics, which is, just dreadful politics.
Yeah. And I resonate with so much what you just said, Lee, because you probably don't know this, but I didn't go to college till I was 26 because I was a working musician. And that's what I tell colleagues. Don't get this, but that's what I tell people. I said, the thing is with musicians, you'll argue about stuff all day about how to do this, but the thing is, you're all there for one reason, to make it happen, right? And so it was really strange for me to come from that environment to academia, where creativity and kind of a free exploration of ideas is not part of the higher education environment. Unfortunately, it should be, but that's what I thought it was. I was kind of a romantic in that sense, that I thought it was going to be like that. And once I got there, I was, wow, this is kind of disappointing. But
when you mentioned Pound, sorry.
No, but it's still there. That hunger was, and I still see it in term musicians who are.
I was just thinking, this is very brief.
Right?
When you mentioned Pound was from Idaho, and I'd known that, I was just thinking great Winvester intellect. So I just Googled on my phone sitting here, had Pound read Thorstein Veblen? That became an interesting question for me. And it said on Twitter that he had read Thorstein Veblen, but I'm just thinking that's the type of way I've always proceeded. These giant minds, where did they get fertilized? And I've just never had, it's what Soloviev called his golden thread. He gives the divine feminine a personification, said she always chose my next book. The divine feminine is kind of golden thread. It's a beautiful image, right?
The ewig weibliche zieht uns hinein. The eternal feminine leads us on.
That's right. You reminded me too. My great temptation in grading papers, especially if it's creative writing, is to not do what Pound did to Eliot, right? Where in the first draft, I think it was The Wasteland, where he kept saying, perhaps it is, and perhaps it is that. And in the margin, Pound wrote, damned perhapsy.
Rick's quoted that to me when he was reading one of my essays. He said, Lee, just get rid of this damn perhaps.
So where do you think it's going to go from here, Lee?
Well, I like your, I don't know if I like it. I mean, I have So my own commitment as a Christian humanist is to try to take the high road, to enter into serious conversations with people. I have a lot of friends who were traditional liberals, folks even who publish in The Nation, but who are interested in preserving the great tradition and in giving everybody access to it, because that's what we want. We want access to these great thinkers and great minds. I suspect that it's going to be, there's a new movement of Christian schools, Christian and classical learning. I think that's going to be important. I think places like Hillsdale are going to continue to do well. I think some of these Protestant colleges in the Midwest, like Hope,
Calvin College,
are going to solidify their mission, and it's going to be good for them. I don't know what Notre Dame is going to do. They weren't ranked particularly high in today's Wall Street Journal rankings. I don't know what they're going to do. I have a bone to pick with their English department, by the way, because it was led by a man, Peter Holland, the Shakespearean Peter Holland, or he was very influential in it. And I have always found him, my opinion is I have always found him unkind to the religion in Shakespeare and to Catholicism in Shakespeare. I have detected a bias in him. I think you see it in his Oxford, the National Dictionary of Shakespeare entry is written by Peter Holland. I think it's unfair. I think it's slanted, and I think it's too bad that Notre Dame, in its liberalism, committed to a guy like that to represent their take on Shakespeare for decades. So I think that's too bad. It's too bad for Notre Dame. The president's probably a decent guy, but they've got a lot to figure out. As far as the Jesuit schools, I think many of them have a good niche. I know Holy Cross has a very good niche. Boston College has a very good niche. So we attract enough well-to-do students. We're rich institutions, so I think, like other wealthy institutions, Harvard and Yale and Williams College, we'll survive, but we'll have a kind of limited clientele, which will be a strange grab bag of the very well-to-do, the demographically select. And I think this is the case, for these privileged institutions. And then I think that for the hoi polloi, so to speak, for many of these public institutions that have been swept by social justice fervor, I think they're going to collapse. I think we will see the collapse of these institutions, which will again stop social mobility. It'll hurt the country. The male population is already, by the way, opting out. The younger
they've
people,
opted out wholesale.
They're opting out in very significant numbers. So this is a serious conversation. I want civilization to continue. I can tell you, I want to keep the flame burning. I don't want universal darkness to bury all, as to quote Pope's Dunciad. Very much on the side of life, civilization, complexity, historical consciousness. I get that history is a very checkered and bleak affair. I get the fact that the Roman Catholic Church, to which I subscribe, has a very checkered history. So, we can talk Turkey here. But we're also in dire straits. Things could really go bad. And I don't revel in that fact, but it's a genuine possibility. I have to let the cat out.
It could be the edge of a new dark ages in a way.
Yeah,
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I also think part of it, which we didn't mention, I mean, part of the reason, so the school where I went, they again folded. It was a product of mismanagement and lies, but also of demographic winter, right? I mean, there aren't the kids to fill those seats, so they're trying. Even some places I'm not kidding. They give out cornhole scholarships.
What's that?
Cornhole
it's a backyard game like badminton or jarts,
where you have like a board with a hole in it. You try to throw a beanbag in it.
Oh yeah, I like that.
College,
it's a fun
I
game.
like it too, but I don't think I wanted to play professional level cornhole in college.
They give scholarships.
They do. I couldn't believe it when I heard.
I just couldn't take it in. What the heck?
Yeah. Well, and the other thing, Now, I noticed this a long time ago at the the Catholic college where I was, and I noticed, and I don't know if you see this at Holy Cross or at other places see it, but the loss of a Catholic identity, especially in the faculty, what they do is all the time they'd hire people who weren't Catholic, and all of a sudden the department was Catholic. Then to be Catholic and to be hired in the department was almost impossible.
And it doesn't help the fact that a lot of the candidates, the Catholic candidates who come up for these positions are pretty hard right wingers. What you need is young scholars who have the elements that we were talking before of the left and the right in their intellectual makeup, so that they have the complexity, they can speak across the aisle. I mean, Francis, for instance, is a complicated figure. It's a complicated legacy. There are things I like about Francis. The pastoral side of Francis I get. Is he the
He skewers the left and right pretty well when he has this kind of pithy, like the right is this, the left is this. It's always pretty spot on.
I think he should have left the Latin Mass alone. I think that was a mistake, and I think it was a political mistake. And of course I miss the gigantic intellectual level of his two immediate predecessors. But nonetheless, he's a complicated guy, and he's a serious Catholic, thoughtful guy. And his experience down there in South America is foreign to me. So I don't understand really what his cultural background is. So I can take it just a step back and do my own work. So as I say, we're concerned about the Catholic identity, and we very well should be. But we have, those of us who are committed to it, have a responsibility to avoid the language of polarization and to somehow find that middle ground, which combines commitment to the Catholic Church with commitment to the American experiment.
Yeah, well, that's
what do you guys make, Michael, too, of? And I don't even know if it's gone too far, and I'm just going from memory. I like Jordan Peterson and Barry Weiss, New York Times, former columnists, that they were forming a university of some kind. Is that still a thing?
I haven't heard.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a place down, I think, is it in Austin?
I think so. That's what I'm talking about. That.
Yeah. I don't know what's been developing there. I haven't heard much about it lately. But because
when you mentioned kind of the right wingness of some of these young kind of Catholic guys, that it could be playing to that same choir, right? Yeah, it's right there. It's right there in the personality of Jordan Peterson, who's partially insightful young scholar and partially just a cultural warrior on the right.
Right. Yeah. He is a
by default. Yeah. So that's probably a good place to start to wind it up. But Lee,
let's have Lee back on for just a conversation. I'm going to read it, but we're going to have you back on for your book on Shakespeare and humanism.
Okay. Yeah.
I insist. I insist.
And so, if people want to follow you, where do they find you, Lee?
Well, I'm on Twitter.
Awesome. I found you
X,
there.
I'm on X. And
most of your tweets are about this subject. He's hitting on the university all the time. Yeah.
It's a nice little crowd, my Twitter friends. We make each other laugh. We tell jokes. Lately, I also go off about Quixote a lot lately because I've been working so hard on Quixote. Okay, final show. Don't forget, folks.
Old Enemies.
The novel, Old Enemies.
I'm going to link it in our notes here too.
Yeah, and that's a satire of the contemporary academy in many ways. That's not all that it is, but it includes that angle. And here is the Shakespeare book, and touted in impressive journals and blah blah blah. Okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much.
All right. Great to
Oser, it's been a pleasure.
All right.
We'll do this again.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye now.